This is Theodore, and tonight we are stepping into a conversation that is as explosive as it is uncomfortable, because what you just heard is not just a rant, it is a reflection of a deeper fracture happening in modern dating culture. Identity, accountability, and perception. And whether people want to admit it or not, these kinds of voices are not emerging out of nowhere. They're being shaped by frustration, repeated patterns, and a growing disconnect between expectations and reality. So let's break this down piece by piece without flinching, because the tone may be harsh, even offensive to many, but the underlying themes are what demand real attention, not the delivery alone. And the first thing that hits hard is the outright condemnation of modern women as a group, which immediately sets the stage for division, defensiveness, and emotional reaction, because sweeping generalizations like that erase nuance and individuality. Yet at the same time, they often gain traction precisely because they echo frustrations that some people feel but don't express publicly. And that's where the tension lies, between exaggeration and lived experience. Now, when the speaker pivots and says not all women, that's less of a correction and more of a shield, because the damage of the generalization is already done. But it also reveals something important. This isn't purely about hatred, it's about disappointment mixed with judgment, and that distinction matters if we're trying to understand rather than just react. Then we move into the core accusation that a large portion of women are embracing what is labeled as low-class, attention-seeking, or self-destructive behavior. And here the argument starts tying behavior to outcomes, specifically relationships that don't lead to commitment, situationships, single motherhood, and a perceived lack of long-term stability. And this is where the narrative becomes less about insult and more about cause and effect framing. Whether accurate or not, the claim is that choices in presentation, values, and partner selection are directly influencing the kind of relationships women experience. And that idea is not new, but it becomes controversial when it's framed as a moral failure rather than a social pattern. Because once morality is introduced, the conversation stops being analytical and starts becoming accusatory. And that's exactly why it triggers such strong reactions. Now, the mention of parenting and fatherless behavior introduces another layer. This shifts the blame from individual choices to upbringing, suggesting that a lack of structure or guidance leads to the behaviors being criticized. And while there is research that shows family structure can influence outcomes, reducing complex human behavior to a single cause like that is an oversimplification, and it risks ignoring economic, cultural, and psychological factors that also play massive roles. But again, the reason this resonates with some audiences is because it offers a clear, if flawed, explanation for messy realities. People often prefer a simple answer over a complicated truth. Now, when the speaker talks about other communities having more stable family structures, that comparison is doing a lot of heavy lifting because it creates an us versus them dynamic, implying that one group is failing while others are succeeding. And whether that perception is accurate or selective depends heavily on which data points you choose to highlight. But in public discourse, perception often matters more than full context, and that's why these comparisons spread so quickly online, especially paired with emotionally charged language. Moving forward, the discussion around dating expectations is where things get more grounded, because the idea that some people demand qualities in partners that they themselves do not possess is a critique that applies across genders, not just women. And this is where the conversation could have turned constructive, because there is a real discussion to be had about alignment, self-awareness, and realistic standards. But instead, it remains framed as a one-sided issue, which weakens its credibility while strengthening its emotional impact. And that trade-off is something we see often in viral content. Clarity gets sacrificed for intensity. Now, when the topic of money, lifestyle, and status comes in, the argument suggests that a focus on financial success in partners is shaping male behavior, pushing men to prioritize wealth over emotional connection. And there is some truth in the idea that incentives shape behavior. If people consistently reward certain traits, others will adapt to meet those expectations. But again, this is not exclusive to one group. It's part of a broader cultural shift where material success is often equated with personal value, and dating becomes transactional rather than relational. And that shift is not happening in isolation. It's tied to social media, economic pressure, and changing gender roles, which brings us to another key point raised: the tension between traditional expectations and modern identity. The claim is that some women want traditional partners while maintaining modern independence, and that this creates incompatibility. But what's missing here is that men are also navigating their own version of that contradiction, wanting traditional loyalty while embracing modern freedom. And so what we're really looking at is not one side failing, but both sides struggling to reconcile outdated frameworks with current realities. And that's why so many relationships feel unstable or undefined, because the rules themselves are unclear. Now, the segment about the matchmaker quitting is particularly telling because it introduces the idea that even professionals in the dating space are becoming frustrated, not necessarily because one gender is impossible to work with, but because expectations across the board have become increasingly rigid and idealized. And when people hold on to a fantasy version of a partner rather than engaging with real individuals, disappointment becomes inevitable. And this is amplified by social media, where curated lives and highlight reels create unrealistic benchmarks. So when someone in real life doesn't measure up, they're dismissed rather than understood. And that cycle repeats over and over, leading to burnout not just for individuals but for those trying to guide them. Now, the discussion around race and dating preferences adds another layer of complexity because it touches on cultural identity, attraction, and social pressure. And while it's true that many people tend to date within their own background, framing deviations from that as unfortunate reveals underlying biases that are rarely addressed openly. And this part of the conversation could have explored how cultural expectations shape personal choices, but instead it leans into normalization of preference without fully unpacking its implications, and that's a missed opportunity for deeper insight. Then we see references to public reactions, comments, and viral clips, which highlight how these conversations are not happening in isolation. They're being amplified, debated, and reshaped by audiences online. And that feedback loop is crucial because it turns individual opinions into collective narratives. And once a narrative takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. People start seeing evidence that supports it while ignoring what contradicts it. And that's how polarization grows. Now, when the speaker addresses criticism, saying that people only react negatively because they don't want to hear the truth, that's a common rhetorical move. It frames disagreement as denial rather than legitimate counterargument, which shuts down dialogue instead of encouraging it. And while it can be effective in rallying supporters, it doesn't lead to meaningful resolution because it assumes one side has all the answers, and real social issues are rarely that simple. Finally, the closing message about self-respect, accountability, and attracting what you reflect is probably the most constructive part of the entire discussion because it shifts the focus back to individual agency, regardless of gender. The idea that personal standards, behavior, and self-perception influence relationship outcomes is widely accepted, but it needs to be applied universally, not selectively. Otherwise, it becomes another tool for blame
shame rather than growth. So where does all of this leave us? It leaves us in a space where emotions are high, perspectives are clashing, and the truth is somewhere in the middle, between exaggerated criticism and defensive denial. The real issue is not whether one group is entirely right or wrong. It's that the dating landscape has changed faster than people have adapted to it. Expectations have evolved without clear communication, and social influences have distorted perceptions of reality. And until there's a willingness to engage with these complexities honestly, without reducing them to insults or absolutes, these conversations will continue to generate more heat than light. And that's the story tonight, not just about what was said, but about why it resonates, why it divides, and why it keeps coming back in different forms across platforms and communities. This is Theodore, and that's the deeper breakdown you weren't supposed to ignore.